We are learning the first Sicha of Parshas Tavo in volume 14, Likutei Sichas. This is a relatively straightforward, easy Sicha, less difficult Sicha, not less gishmak, not less sweet and delicious, even though it's a Rashi Sicha nominally, which tend to be difficult and technical. This one is rather straightforward and more on the sweet side. The discussion of the Torah portion right at the beginning is the mitzvah of Bikurim, bringing the first fruit. Torah says that when the Jewish people will come to the promised land and they will establish themselves there, and everyone has their own home and their vineyard and their fields, they have a mitzvah to take the first fruit that begins to ripen and mark it off. They would put the equivalent of an ancient rubber band around the first fruit of each type to indicate that those were the first that ripened. And then when they're ready to be taken off the tree, off the field, off the tree, they would put it into a big basket and bring it as a gift to the temple, and it would be offered up to the Kohen and elevated next to the altar, and etc. And it was a big deal. The mitzvah of Bikurim, the first fruits, there was a whole parade. People would dress up their oxen with all kind of jewels as they would lead the parade, and many Jews from along the parade route from all over Israel would join this parade heading towards Jerusalem for Bikurim time, which was the holiday of Shavuos, the first harvest. And they would have these gorgeous baskets. The wealthy people would have silver and gold baskets. Other people would have woven baskets, but they were beautifully decorated and presented. One of the important agricultural mitzvahs, and it represents gratitude. You gave me a land, you gave me a home, you gave me a field and a vineyard. I'm providing for myself. It's an extraordinary thing. And not only I'm going to be thankful, but I'm going to take the first fruits, which represents the first success, the first fruits of my labor, which typically a farmer would hold precious, and say, no, I'm going to give the first ones away to God in recognition that they belong to God. Incidentally, the previous Rabbi points out that this is akin to the idea that every day, the first hours of our day, we should give to God. We should choose the first hours of our day for Torah study and prayer when we're freshest, in recognition of the gratitude that God is the one who gave us another day, rather than saving the last hour of the day when we're totally exhausted, the freshest hour. It also has a connection to the fact that our firstborn belong to God. Of course, we redeem them, representing that the first and the finest are ultimately, we're willing to give them away in recognition that everything is God's. Another application of this mitzvah in an indirect way nowadays, that we don't have this mitzvah physically because we don't have the temple yet, is the fact that give your best to the mitzvah. You have the best food, save it for Shabbos. Your finest suit, wear it for Shabbos, etc. So in the mitzvah of Bikurim, of the first fruits, the Torah teaches us that there was a proclamation that was said by the person as they came to the temple. They would proclaim, and they would give a proclamation. The proclamation would be an expression of gratitude, but it would go back in time to the beginning of our history. And it would talk about some of the sad times of the beginning of Jewish history. How Laban tried to destroy Jacob and destroy our people before we had a chance to begin, and how that came this close to happening. We're lucky we survived it. And then that wasn't enough. We went down to Egypt and we were tortured and beaten and overworked and tortured for a very long time. The Egyptians are terrible, a little bit of a narrative about that, and how God came and redeemed us from that problem as well, where our people were on the cusp of destruction. And finally, at long last, God brought us to this place. Not only He saved us from the aforementioned, but He brought us to this place, a land flowing in milk and honey, and now we bring the fruits of our place to God. And as Rashi indicates, Maskir chazdei hamokim. We remember, we recount the kindness of God. So the Rebbe asks a very simple and straightforward question. If we want to recount the tsuris of the beginning, the origins of our people, in order to show the contrast of where we are now, that we have our own land and we're comfortable, in gratitude to God, why do we only mention these two things? Laban, who threatened our people, and Egypt. There are many other things that happened to our people since the birth of our nation, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, up until this point, which were equally miraculous and important to the survival of our people. And the Rebbe lists a few. For example, the splitting of the sea and all the miracles that sustained us for 40 long years in the desert. The water that came from the well of Miriam, the heavenly clouds, the daily miraculous bread that fell down, plus the miracle later on where the Jews walked between the two valleys, between the two mountains, and the enemies were hiding in the mountains to ambush them, and little did the Jews even know that the mountains came together to crush them and save the Jews. It's not such a well-known miracle. It's in this book of Numbers. Plus, before the war of Amalek, the other wars, how come none of that is mentioned? Also before Egypt, when Jacob was running away from his brother Esau, and then the showdown with Esau with the 400 men that Jacob was afraid for his life. And his brother, we know his brother intended originally to kill him. He was spared from that. That's a miracle. Also, when Jacob is escaping the people of Canaan, who Jacob felt they were out to kill him after what happened in the city of Shechem, where the two sons of Jacob wiped out the city. And the Torah testifies that he was protected from them only because God sent a special fear and protection. So there's a whole list here. There's a whole list. And yet none of these are mentioned. And the only two that are mentioned is Laban and Egypt. What happened to the rest? And the Rabbi first says, well, maybe many of these can be lumped in together with Exodus. Like all the miracles that happened post-Exodus, the splitting of the sea and all the miracles of the desert, we can sort of call it as a PS to Exodus, and therefore it's not delineated separately, but it's not such a satisfactory answer. But okay, well, let's say there still is the original miracle of Esau, and that showdown. How is that any less than Laban? And then the Rebbe suggests, well, when someone might say that Esau was only a perceived threat, but it turned out not to be a threat at all. Esau hated Jacob initially, but by the time they met, for whatever reason, the gifts that he presented him and the angel of Jacob that fought with the angel of Esau, whatever other reasons, Esau had a change of heart and he actually kissed Jacob. And there was no actual threat. It was only a fear of a threat. So maybe that's why that's not considered a big miracle, because in the end, nothing ever happened that was really bad. But if that's the case, says the Rabbi, if Esau is just a perceived threat, so is Laban. Laban pursued Jacob and he was out to get him, but in the end, he did nothing. Because of the dream that God came to him and threatened him, it doesn't matter. So if Laban is worthy of mentioning, and that's still considered a miracle, even though it was a threat that didn't pan out, why is Esau less important? All told, the Rebbe is asking a very significant question. The Torah says, I want you to come to the temple with your bikurim, your first fruit, and proclaim your gratitude to God for Jewish history, a history of humble, painful beginnings where we came this close to annihilation, and only with God's grace and miracle upon miracle, time and again and yet again, did we survive to come to the Holy Land and be our own people. Why choose two out of the list of, I don't know, we put together a list of 10. Only Laban and Exodus? What happened to Esau? What happened to running away from the Canaanites after Shechem? What happened to the splitting of the sea and all the numerous miracles in the desert? The Amalekite war, Sichon and Og, that's another miraculous war against two superpowers of the time, and then finally the miracle of the walking between the mountains. None of that is even mentioned. And the question is, the reason why this is a Rashi conversation, because the principle is that Rashi's job is to address any issues that arise in the literal understanding of text. So when Rashi says something, it means that we know that there's something wrong on the literal level of understanding text, which Rashi is trying to explain. Although Rashi writes everything smooth and doesn't write question answer, he just makes statements. But as the famous book goes, what's bothering Rashi? Anytime Rashi comments on any level, what's bothering Rashi? Meaning, what is problematic with the simple literal reading of the text that Rashi is trying to explain by his comment? But when Rashi is silent, by the same token, then that infers that there's nothing wrong with the text on the textual level, and that by just reading the text carefully and contemplating on what it says and what is written in prior texts and prior Rashis, the student of text will have no issue. Why would the student of text have no issue with this monumental question that the Rebbe is posing, so much so that Rashi does not even address the issue? It's so self-understood why only those two should stand out, that Rashi has no need to comment at all. The text said it. How is it so? So the Rebbe gives a brilliant yet simple answer. The Rebbe says the mitzvah of bringing the Bikurim first fruit, if you read it carefully, is not just a general gratitude, but it's a more specific gratitude. It's a gratitude to God, not just for saving us and doing things for us. You know, we have a whole Pesach Seder when we give gratitude to God. We have daily prayers. We have Thanksgiving offerings. Bikurim is a specific gratitude for bringing us to a place. As the text says, we thank you for bringing us to this place and blessing us in that place. Meaning to say, we're thanking God for the fact that as a people, this is the first time when we come to the Holy Land that we're finally in a place which is blessed. Whereas in all prior times where we were in our own place, where we lived in a place, by contrast to when we were traveling and running for our lives, the prior times that we were in a specific place, we were still threatened. So we compare apples to apples. The Torah is speaking about the gratitude to God for blessing us when we're in the place of the wonderful land of Israel, flowing with milk and honey, by contrast to what? To other places where our people had settled up until that point. And there were only two such places. By Laban, we spent 20 years, and then in Egypt, 210 years. Other than that, we didn't have a day of settling at all. We were constantly on the run. So that wouldn't be apples to apples. If we want to compare apples to apples, we say, look how we were in previous settlements, when we called a place home. Laban, we called it home, 20 years. Jacob was there. He prospered, he built a family, he settled. But Abrach, what kind of settled that was? He was threatened with his life and afraid for his very life by Laban. And again, 210 years in Egypt, again, we finally have some peace and quiet. We're living in one place and we're not running. Oh my God, how terrible were those years. Finally, now we come to a place, but this place is blessed, this place is positive, it's peaceful, and it's prosperous. So there only makes sense to mention those two miracles, Laban and Exodus, which reflect the way life was for us in previous places of settlement. To talk about miracles that happened for the whole 40 years in the desert, or when Jacob is running away from Shechem or Esau, and all these escapes that took place for our people, other than these 20 years and 210 years respectively. That's a different type of miracle, a different type of gratitude. The Rebbe doesn't say this, but maybe for that we thank God on Passover night. We survived the Red Sea. We survived all kind of stuff. On Sukkot, we thank God for the miracles of the desert. Bikurim is a gratitude for a specific thing, comparing our current settlement to previous settlements. You know, you might talk to some of the Jews, European Jews who came over to this country, if you had a good conversation with your bubbies and zadis. And And they'll talk to you about how life is in America versus to how life was back in Poland or Russia. And they're expressing gratitude for this blessed country. It's different than people expressing gratitude for other blessings in life. God forbid somebody was ill and now they're healthy. Remember back in the day we were poor and now we're successful. And these are all legitimate forms of gratitude that we should do, and we do them in our prayers. But there's a special gratitude. You know, maybe a Grine, an American, a Jew who emigrated from Europe to America might celebrate, I don't know, on the 4th of July with a special barbecue and say, thank you, God, for bringing us to this country, which is so different than what it was in Poland and in Europe and other places along the way. They're comparing settlement to settlement. And therefore, it's only appropriate to speak of life in those settings when we were settled. And it's not appropriate, it's not fitting to speak of other challenges that this Grine, this European Jew may have had over the years, financial or medical or otherwise, which have nothing to do with this blessed country. They have to do with just God's blessings otherwise. So when you're comparing, when you're speaking about a blessing of living in a blessed country, a blessed place, the operative word here is place, it's in the text. Thank you, God, for bringing us to this place, unquote. It's only fitting to compare it to Laban and Exodus, the two things that happened to us of salvation while we were in other former places. Think about it, friends. It's such a simple explanation, even as it's brilliant. The Rebbe now explains this on a mystical level. Everything in Torah has its spiritual, Kabbalistic / Hasidic side, psychological application, making us a better Jew in our service of God, even though the simple sense of Bikurim we don't have today. And the Rebbe gets a little bit Kabbalistic. I'm just going to skim the surface of it. I'm not going to cover it all. And the Rebbe says that in Kabbalah and Hasidism, a tree is a person, our life, our soul, you might say. And just like a tree has deep roots into the ground, deep and deep and deep, and then the branches and everything else, our soul, the divine soul, the neshama, not the animal animating soul that every creature has, but the neshama of a yid, the Jewish soul, which is literally a spark of the divine. Like the tree, it has deep roots. It's rooted in God himself. The Kabbalah speaks of our soul, which is within our bodies, as something that comes from the highest worlds of Atzilus, of emanation, and it comes down through the spiritual hishtalshelus. It's called the chain of the various spiritual realities to come into our body. We say this, we allude to the journey of the four worlds that soul comes down through in our morning blessing, Elokai neshama shenatzata bi, God, the soul that you put in me. Taharahi, it's pure. Ata barasa, you created it. Ata yitzarta, you formed it. Ata nafachta bi, you blew it into me. 4 levels. Pure represents the soul in its original source in the world of emanation, Atzilus, when the soul is but part of God's breath prior to even breathing it out. You and I at that point are part of God. You created it, that's the world of creation, Beria. You formed it, that's a world of emanation, Yetzirah. You blew it in me, that's the world of action, the physical world, where the soul comes into the physical body. And that is manifest in the expression of a tree. There's deep roots going deep into the source. And then it comes out in a tree. And finally you have a fruit. Kabbalistically, the fruit represents the level of the soul when it's manifest in the physical body. The lowest manifestation of soul. A divine soul which somehow is able to function in a physical human body. A far cry from what that soul looks like deep in its root in the world of spirituality, formation, creation, emanation, or in God's essence before God blows it, where the soul is literally like God. And now it's a human being, or it's embodied in a human being. Wow, it's akin to a little fruit, a little pomegranate. I'm using it as an example because that's a popular fruit to bring for Bikurim. A little pomegranate, by comparison to its deep roots, maybe hundreds of feet in the ground, sapping up energy from the earth itself. So the fruit of Bikurim is analogous to the soul as it's embodied in the physical body. The furthest place from its original source, the lowest form, the lowest manifestation of soul, where it's become almost humanized. And the Torah says, when you bring Bikurim, what does it mean? It's a celebration of our divinity, of our holiness, of our Jewishness, of our soulfulness, not on high, but right here in the physical. There's a place in Judaism for a celebration of our soul's higher levels. Maybe that's what we do when we say Modani or Elokai Neshama, the prayer that I just alluded to. There's times in the prayer when we speak of the soul, when we relate to the deeper self, the greater self, the part of our soul which is much loftier. And that's something to know about and think about. It's beyond the purview of this conversation, but the various levels of prayer represent the various levels of the soul. The 3 daily prayers represent the 3 levels that we just discussed in the 3 prior worlds. And then the additional prayer of Shabbat, the 4th prayer, and the prayer of Shabbat or Musaf, which is added on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, that's the 4th world. And the 5th prayer in the Elah that's added only on Yom Kippur, that's the essence. So there's place in Judaism to focus on and to celebrate and to tap into the essence of our soul as it is way beyond the physical body and the manifestation of the soul therein. But there's another side to the story. There's a place in Judaism not to try to climb up the mountain, but to come down the mountain. There's a place in Judaism not to celebrate how lofty a source we come from within the divine, but how mundane a place that lofty soul is manifest in the here and now, and how within that place of physicality, a place of time and space, the most mundane limitations, which don't exist in the spiritual realms and certainly not in the divine realms. Time and space denote limitation, physicality. And within time and space, within a body, no less, the soul still somehow on some level remembers its source. We still pluck that fruit. We still dedicate a part of our soul to its origin, to God and his service. That's the spiritual correlation of the mitzvah of Bikurim. Don't tell me how lofty your soul is in its essence, in the Pintele Yid, in the spark of the divine that you have way up in heaven. Tell me how your humanity, your neshama, your Jewish soul within your human body, which all but forgets its source, doesn't forget it, and still finds it through prayer and Torah study and mitzvahs, and through physical acts, mundane acts, even in business and in day-to-day living of eating and drinking and what have you, and in all of those physical acts, bodily acts, and for all of those to be done in a fashion where the soul shines through, where the divine soul, whose origin, whose roots go deep way into God's essence, remains true to its source, and it eats food, but it eats it like a Jew, like a Yid, like a soul. It does business, but it does it like a soul, without greed and without envy and with honesty and with charity. And the same is with everything, every human behavior in life, not even a mitzvah behavior, human behavior. Behaviors that are related to the place. That's the operative word of this Sicha. Borrowing from the text, the mitzvah of Bikurim is bring it to that place. Celebrate your spirituality the way it's manifest in the world of place, in the world of space, in real life. Not even in your mitzvah life here on earth, but in your human life here on earth, and in that human life, to do it all with the right approach and to find God in every aspect of reality. That's the theme of the Bikurim. Not how far from earth you can run in your meditation and prayer. There's a place for that in Judaism, but that's not Bikurim. But how focused you can remain on, and how true you can remain to your true self when you're involved in the most mundane activities. How true you can remain to your true self and your true essence, your spiritual ancestor, if you will, when the fruit is plucked from the tree, when you're living a mundane life which seems to have very little resemblance to its heavenly source. And that's how the Rabbi ends the Sicha and says the takeaway, the source is to make God a home in the physical, not just by physical mitzvahs, but by living in enlightened existences, even in our day-to-day activities. Finding God in the place, in the world that we live in, the finite physical reality, where we're just human beings. We're humans with a soul. We're humans with a purpose. It's different. The Rebbe quotes in his book of meditation, the Hayom Yom, the Rebbe quotes and he says that a chassid, an inspired Jew, is someone whose every behavior is differently. I don't have the book in front of me to quote exactly, so you'll forgive me, but to quote, the concept is that everything that a chassid does is different. He sleeps, it's a chassid who sleeps. He eats, it's a chassid who eats. It's a different type of person, and I would be remiss to if I didn't tell you that the Rebbe was once asked by a Jew who was newly observant, taking baby steps in Jewish observance, and he said to the Rebbe, can I consider myself your chassid? I'm not fully committed. I'm not doing everything. I don't have a beard and a sheitel. And the Rebbe said, if you're on the journey and you're growing in your Jewishness, I'm proud to call you my chassid. So to me, my understanding is the Rebbe's translation of a chassid isn't what you're doing so much as which direction you're going. If you're an inspired yid and you're living mitzvahs with joy and with animation and with excitement, you're a chassid. And a chassid is recognized not so much by how they light Shabbos candles or put on tefillin, but more so how they eat and how they sleep and how they endeavor in business. How they live the life of Bikurim, how they recognize the godly gratitude that they have within the place. And the Rebbe substantiates this approach by borrowing a word from Rashi. Not only does the text say, I believe more than once, you brought us to this place. It doesn't say this land, it says that too, but the emphasis is the place. But Rashi too, when he speaks about the mitzvah of Bikurim and he speaks about these miracles that we mentioned earlier of Laban and Exodus, Rashi says, and I quote, Maskir chaste hamokum. The text reminds us, mentions the kindnesses of God, but it doesn't use the word for God, the typical word, Chazdei Hashem, Chazdei Elokim. It says Hamakom. Hamakom is a borrowed term for God, which should translators call it the omnipresent. Makom literally means the place. It's a reference to God that represents that God fills all space. Why would the Torah and why would Rashi use that term, that we are reminding ourselves of the kindnesses of a makom, of God, of space, so to speak, of the omnipresent? Why not use another term for God? It's unusual for Rashi to use that term. And the Rebbe says Rashi's hinting in the wine of Torah within the Rashi, in the depth, the spirituality within the Rashi. He's hinting to the aforementioned brilliant teaching of the Rebbe. The message here is the kindnesses of God as he's present, as he's the omnipresent, as he's present within space and within our world. That's the kindness of Bikurim, and that's the gratitude, and that's what we give back to God in the message of this Torah portion of Bikurim, namely not finding God in spirituality alone, but finding God within reality. Thanks much.